With us today is Ambassador Phil Carter, who has had a long and distinguished career at the State Department and now is the president of the Mead Hill Group and the executive vice president of the Jefferson Waterman International Company. And before that, Phil has been ambassador to Guinea and to the Ivory Coast. He's been the acting assistant secretary of state for Africa at the State Department, and he's been the deputy commander at AFRICOM for a few years. And before that, he served mostly in Africa, but Mexico, Canada, Bangladesh, and other places with the State Department. So he's had a long career that involved the 3 continents at least, and a long experience not just on the diplomatic side, but with the military and the intersection with development activities as well. And he's going to talk a little bit about that today. And then, given his experience in the Foreign Service and his long history there, he has perhaps some thoughts on careers and how you work your way into that critter called the Foreign Service or the State Department. And so with that, Phil, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. The task for me is to kind of serve a variety of different kinds of audiences. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, just to talk about this issue of civil-military relations and that nexus between development and security, and how does one operate in that environment. I think there's a couple of fundamental things that in my career that I've seen an evolution in. When I started in the Foreign Service back in the day, development and politics, development and security and everything else were separate lanes, separate stovepipes, not related, managed independent of one another. There was little coordination, little discussion between defense attachés and aid mission directors in terms of their programming. That has changed. There is now a clear-cut and absolute recognition that you can't have development without security, and you can't have security without development. And that if you don't have that right kind of balance in terms of your program, it will tip over. It will run askew. It will hit a reef. Whatever adage you want to use, it's not going to work. And the other thing is that it's always harder than you think it is. And it takes longer than you assumed it would. And what you want and what they need tend to be very different things. And that you need to have an understanding in a 360-degree, three-dimensional understanding of the environment in which you're operating in. So how does one do that? And what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to engage. It means you have to talk to people. It means you have to kind of understand not just the country or the community that you're trying to deal with in terms of development issues, but also the team that you're with, the collection of individuals and their institutions that you're working with. And on the civ-mil side, there is completely different lexicons, completely different orientations, completely different processes that only now are we beginning to fuse together. And frankly, it's been distorted in many respects. It's getting better, but we have a long way to go. And I would say that in this context, the United States is further along than most other donor countries, to be perfectly candid with you. We show our warts and our wrinkles to everybody, but I think in many respects there is a much more vigorous, rich dialogue, disagreement, yelling back and forth on this subject between how does one collaborate, how does one cooperate, how does one collectively move forward than in any other country I've seen. And I've worked with a bunch of them. So how does one do this? Well, one, you have to have an understanding of what is the objective. What is the goal that's to be achieved? And if it isn't clearly articulated, you don't have one. And you'd be surprised how hard it is to articulate that objective in a way that is understandable to everyone on your team. And then you have to do what I would call strategic communications. It's basic management skills. You know, you talk to somebody, you talk to a team of people, and they're hearing what you're telling them, and then you want them to tell you what they heard. And you need to get that feedback loop. And it needs to be a sincere one. And you're going to find it in that, getting that feedback loop is where you're going to find the institutional obstacles and walls that are there from where these people are coming from. The distrust. And there is distrust. There is suspicion. People have their agendas. They want to move things forward. Development agencies' raison d'etre is to provide resources for countries to develop. The security services, the U.S. military, their job is to protect the United States and to kill our enemies. And you have to be bald about this. You have to, a good soldier is trained to do what? To destroy the enemy. A good development officer is there to work with the local community it can uplift itself in a sustainable and durable way. A diplomat, their job is to maintain that relationship, maintain that dialogue through thick and through thin. You can understand where the challenges will come. And managing that, understanding that, is critical. Okay? So I've talked enough about that. And what are we trying to do? It's all about institution building. It's all about developing capabilities of our partners so that they can address the security and development challenges on their own in a sustainable way. We want to eventually kind of look to how we can work ourselves out of a job, have a sunset to move to. Unfortunately, a lot of our programming doesn't have that. A lot of it is just perpetual. It's a never-ending machine because the bureaucracy behind it continues to put it forward. And I think to be effective in terms of what we're looking at, in terms of the dialogue between development agencies, diplomatic services, and militaries, is to have that objective clearly stated with a timeline, with some kind of net results. What you're going to find in the military is that they have a very strict, they're very well trained in terms of what they call the military decision-making process. I kid you not. Military decision-making process. They are trained in that process. And it is very linear, it's very analytical, all right? And it makes sense. I mean, if your job is to take that hill, if your job is to develop a tactic or a strategy to destroy the enemy, to engage, to understand that battle space, you're going to have this process. And it's worked. We have the best military on the planet. And it's very successful in many respects. From the development agency side, they have what they call a logical framework, right? Where you kind of work it all out, and it's a similar process, though it is not as rigorous, it's not as structured, and it's useful. In the diplomatic arena, we don't have any process. We just kind of engage the way we can. Because it's a never-ending story. Things change all the time. We have our basic policy guidance that's given to us, and we try to figure out how to make it work. What I would recommend is that you have to understand those processes, because with that, then you can start doing the meshing between the civil-military relationship. One of the biggest experiences I had when I was the deputy commander at AFRICOM was that I had to really struggle to understand their lexicon. Words that I thought meant something completely different to my military colleagues. Their definitions were different than mine. And I had to understand what those words meant and the context in which they meant. And the problem you have in our military in many respects is that you have the different services and they each have their own culture. They each have their own lexicon. And a lot of the time that you see at these combatant commands is where they're interacting with one another, where Army's learning how to speak Navy, and Navy's trying to figure out what the Marines are saying, and no one understands what the Air Force is talking about. You know, that's one thing. Going purple, they call it, right? That's difficult in and of itself. But at a combatant command like AFRICOM, where you then have this overlay of civilian architecture, where you not only have the State Department, but you have AID, you have DHS, you have, we had Department of Interior there at one point, okay? Makes it even more complicated. And then on top of that, you have the international organizations and our partners, our European partners, our Japanese partners, European Union, the African Union, the United Nations, and our non-traditional partners, like Korea and China, for example, working together trying to find common solutions to security challenges in Africa. And then there's the Africans. Don't forget that. And so trying to understand that is a very complicated thing when you have been raised in your professional career to follow the military decision-making process. Or you would, with aid, with your logical framework, and you have to learn how to fold in these other processes. I also made it more complicated when I came back to the point about what I mentioned before. What is the end state? What is that objective? How are you going to get there? How long is it going to take you to get there? How long are you going to be doing this for? What does success look like? These are hard questions that you need to put up front when you're engaging with folks. One thing you're going to find is that the dialogue never ends. They're always talking to each other. There's never the steady state is change. The steady state is moving forward. The steady state is constant conversations, sharing of information. That can be difficult because for many within our bureaucracies, information is power, information suggests control, information is kept in reserve. I have found that in terms of dealing with this security-military nexus within planning stages, that you have to tear that down, that you have to foster honest conversations amongst everyone. It can be in closed doors, it should be, so that you can move things forward and have an appreciation for that. There are some challenges I see, though, and this is something within the U.S. military that we're going to have to look at. My own personal experience is that we are now at one generation for the new volunteer military in the U.S. And I'm concerned about it because it seems to be an increasingly separate subculture from the rest of the American culture. In many respects, they're like the Legionnaires. They're independent, they have a separate culture, and their relationship and their relations and their understanding of the drivers that are underlying American society are not what they should be, in my opinion. It is a challenging thing. But this is, I think, a consequence of an all-volunteer force that has its own culture and is increasingly isolated from the day-to-day living, day-to-day issues, concerns, trends within our country. And I think that creates a problem. I think the State Department itself, too, with people who live overseas all the time, when they come back, they have to rediscover their own country, is an issue. Now, modern telecommunications, web, Facebook, all that makes things a little bit easier, but I also have found the challenge has been that we have tended to, as a result of the technologies in front of us, a lot of the senior officers I dealt with hated PowerPoint. Why? And they can understand why. Very few issues we have can be distilled to a graph with a couple of bullets in a two-dimensional surface. It dumbs things down when, frankly, they should be dumbed up. And so what we tried to do at AFRICOM to help that dialogue was to put away the PowerPoint. We weren't successful. But what we tried to do is have people brief us without reference to it, that they had to talk about it. Because then, through that narrative, you can understand the issues that were there. So that was what I found. In my own personal career is that having that dialogue, pursuing that dialogue, understanding the other person's raison d'etre, why they're there, what's important to them, is important to kind of bring people together. In the military, one has to understand the battle space, the operational environment. And that is what you go back to when you're dealing with them in this security development nexus. More and more of our military leadership understands that security is ephemeral without development, and you have to have it there. But that the development picture itself can't be just isolated. We have problems in our development scheme. AID, for example, 75–80% of it is for health, international health programs, which is good. We need more for democracy, governance, and economic growth. And that needs to be changed. And from the military perspective, that's where you need to have that assistance. That's where you need to work with local communities so they can appreciate and have better relationships with their own institutions. What's also coming to the fore is this division between what we would call state security and civilian security, or human security, or citizen security. The basic adage has been in the past, and we've had this with AID as well in our development things, that you work with the institution, you improve the capacity of the institution, and being the community is served well. There's an assumption that that institution can provide service or is interested in providing service to its citizens. That's an assumption that one must test. And what we're finding now is that, going in and giving foreign military cool stuff to play with doesn't necessarily mean that the security of the community is going to be addressed. It doesn't mean that the security perspectives of those institutions are married to the security concerns of the local communities. And helping foster that dialogue is an important one. That's also part of the security development nexus that needs to be strengthened. And I have found that's an important aspect. You address those issues, and what you have is a kind of a virtuous cycle that can develop. But it requires constant application of effort, constant time. And the problem we have is that people are moving in and out of these posts. The average tenure for the military to combatant command is about 2 years. Foreign service officers are at embassies for about 2 years. Everyone's there for 2 years, maybe 4. All right? How does one maintain constancy and consistency when you're constantly rotating individuals? It comes back to communication, comes back to engagement, comes back to constantly telling you this is a never-ending story. Just keep doing it. But with an idea that you're going to move yourself off the stage so that eventually our African friends are now playing in that role themselves, and that we are working together in a mutual way to address the security concerns, the development challenges that we all face. That's part and parcel of it. There's also recognition that we're all members of institutions, and that those institutions are driven by other issues, and so as a result, there's distortions in terms of funding, there's distortions in terms of the programming, and that one has to manage that issue honestly and recognize the limitations of that, and not to overpromise, oversell, and underdeliver. And that's really what we have to face as well. And I've seen that happen a lot. It isn't easy, it's hard. And I have found that in many respects, our African friends understood what we were trying to do better than our Washington backstop offices. And the greatest crisis I see in some respects because of technology is that someone found a 6,000-mile screwdriver and they're using it on everything. Washington micromanaging what needs to be done in the field. The Pentagon telling folks how to do stuff to address security questions too directly. You know, that's a challenge. So, what does it mean for all of you who are looking to work in this sector? How does one get experience in this? Well, one, join the military. I don't think a lot of people here are going to do that. Peace Corps is another area. You need the field experience. A lot of, back in the day, when you were involved in international affairs, you studied international affairs. You studied area studies. You studied in African issues or Latin America or Russian studies. That has gone the wayside, and people now focus a lot on things like, conflict prevention and international development and international relations, as if it can be kind of formalized in some kind of scientific method. Nothing beats ground experience. Nothing, the value of saying, been there, that street cred, when you've had that red laterite soil of Africa on the bottom of your soles of your feet, and you understand it, it's important. I'll give you an example. AFRICOM. I used to give talks every 2 weeks to the new people coming on board, and the evolution of AFRICOM of the military towards Africa is changing. A lot of positive things. One, they don't look at Africa as a country, and that Nelson Mandela is not the president of Africa. All right, and that Djibouti is not Africa, because the one physical presence of the military in a long-term fashion is in Djibouti. And so when you say, how many people have been to Africa, and they all raise their hands, and you say, how many people have been to Africa outside of Djibouti, and all the hands go down. I don't know if you've been to Djibouti, but it has nothing in relationship to Congo. The other thing is that we tend to, with Africa, in the development side, on the policy side, we tend to address Africa as a whole. We don't talk about Latin America as a whole. We don't talk about Europe as a whole, or Asia. We talk about the countries. There are 54 countries in Africa. And the continent's a big place. Will, you know this better than anybody else. This is a guy who's been banging around trying to do security stuff for God knows how long. Right? 54 countries. You could put 3 continental Americas in Africa, the continent of Africa, and still have room to run around. You can put the continental United States, China, Western Europe, Australia, the UK islands. What else am I forgetting? Just put something else in there, maybe Mexico, throw that in there for a good. Yeah. And you still have room. It's a big place. The maps that we look at, Randy McNally maps, are distorted. You know, I just have to tell you. So we have to recognize the diversity that's there. You have to recognize that Africans have solutions to some of their problems and they need help in developing those solutions. But that, you know, the American way of fighting a war, the American way of conflict, the American way of development, it may not be applicable to the Moroccans. Or what we do in Morocco may not apply to what goes on in Botswana. And for the military, one of my biggest challenges was to tell them that the hard lessons and the muscle memory of Afghanistan and Iraq, nation building, which hasn't worked, by the way, those lessons of engagement, dealing with AID and stuff like that, you can't translate that experience and make it like it's going to work completely in Africa and with our different embassies. One, we don't have embassies the size of Baghdad or Kabul anywhere else in the world. I mean, they're ridiculously big. All right? In Africa, there tend to be much more junior people. They tend to be people who are new to the Foreign Service, you know, and then you have military folks who have never been to Africa, who don't understand it. A lot of them are in AFRICOM because it's in Germany, and Germany's a nice place. And so trying to understand that, and they're there for just 2 years. A lot of them have just come out, you know, they've been fighter pilots, they've been tank drivers, artillerymen, medics, budget analysts on a ship in the Pacific, and next thing you know, boom, they're the desk officer for the Congo. You know, and they're trying to figure out what everyone's talking about because they speak Navy, they don't speak Army, much less international stuff. And so there's a huge learning curve. And so our military is grappling with that. And the pain and challenges of Afghanistan and Iraq highlight that need. But that flexibility, that suppleness to engage with our local partners is something that they have to yet understand. And we have to help that, because we cannot be successful if we are doing development or we're doing diplomacy without bringing our defense colleagues along with us. It's our obligation, it's our responsibility to the sustainable security of our country. To be effective with that, you have to have street cred, which means you have had to have been there. There's a lot of folks I meet since I've retired who think they can talk about Africa with a college degree and working in Washington. Or they can talk about any country or international affairs simply by working on policy in DC or New York. That'll get you so far. You've got to be there. And I mean more than just flying in, zipping in with a delegation, staying at some Radisson or some Hilton, and then flying out. I mean, you got to get out there. You got to get some of that little flora in your stomach. You know what I mean? You got to understand what it's like to be in a village with no power. You know, everyone would say, we're going to use the internet to solve problems of development in Africa. Well, okay, well, let's get that electricity thing going first, though. It's hard to have internet when there's no juice. When we talk about the internet, we have to recognize the Africans have jumped us. You know, they do everything on their smartphones, everything. You know, Apple Pay, woo-woo, it was going on in the Congo,
yeah.
What, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
Come on, give me a break. So there's a lot of things that you have to, but you don't know that unless you're there. So get there. And I know I'm from Africa, but you know, I've been to Bangladesh, I've been to Mexico. You know, if there's a place that interests you, go there, hang out. Get out of the capital. Mix it up. Okay? And there are agencies that do that, volunteering organizations, NGOs, you know, relief agencies. They are all desperately looking for people to help them out. That's important to have, to gain that experience. And then when you come back, you then have to learn the interagency process. How do these agencies relate to one another? How do they function or dysfunction? And then on top of that, the international community. And by then you're totally confused and you're ready to retire. Okay? I've been very general about things, and I'll leave it to questions now.
Thank you. While you think of questions, I'll start out with the first one.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, when you ask a question, please state who you are and your affiliation so he knows who he's talking to. Can I go back to your very earlier comments? You talked about the distrust between the civilians and the military.
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
When I got there, they were trying to, at AFRICOM, well, first of all, I talked about that generation, post-Vietnam generation of leadership that's gone through the military. I can speak of the Army more specifically, but, you know, there is a distrust of the civilian world. They don't understand it. They think that, I've actually had officers tell me, wow, until I was a foreign area officer, I didn't know you could be a patriot without wearing the uniform. And as an ambassador, I said, well, thank you very much. That's not an uncommon view, that only the military are the patriots in our country. No. What about policemen, firemen, diplomats, nurses, teachers? But that kind of self-awareness isn't there. It's very there, and so as a result, they feel that they know what's right. They have the processes. They've been in the fight. How can a civilian tell them how to deal with security? The other thing is that for them, it's all about them. AFRICOM, I had to keep reminding AFRICOM that, hey, aid is actually more important than the military in Africa. It was hard. When the Ebola crisis hit, okay, and the military was brought in to do what it can do very well, build things, train people, logistics. We're great at that. But the interaction, and the commander was very clear, we are there to support AID, which is the lead agency on this. And we had to constantly remind people, including the President of the United States, that the military was not the lead. Okay? And then we wanted to get out of it. And we provided that technical and that physical space so that people, the international community, working with AID, led by AID and CDC, could get engaged effectively. That was a big lesson for our guys, to realize that they were in support and that they weren't in charge. And that was the senior guys got it. It's the lieutenant colonels, the majors, the captains that we're talking about. Make sense?
Yeah. Well, I was telling somebody the other day, just for my own, my background is disaster assistance in AID, and when the military hits the ground, the first thing they ask is who's in charge. The wrong question. You don't ask that. Nobody's in charge. And if you ask that, in particular of an NGO, you really have a problem, because they don't want the military telling them. So the cultures are very different.
Yeah, and they have a challenge. If there's a vacuum, they'll fill it.
Yep.
Don't give them the vacuum.
Okay, questions? Please.
Yes, sir.
Joel Starr, Lieutenant Colonel Army JAG Corps.
Yes, sir.
Joel Starr, Lieutenant Colonel Army JAG Corps
Colonel,
Reserve.
how you doing?
Ambassador, good to see you. And former Deputy Assistant Administrator, Alleged Affairs, USAID. Good to see you again, Ambassador. Having a foot in both camps, if you could just explain a little bit further about the chain of command. You were the deputy commander, not in uniform, and as you know, in the military, commanders can order people over the hill.
Yes.
And into battle. Was there any bit of dissidence, any difficulty in that? Did anybody approach you? How did you handle it? Thank you.
And let me be perfectly candid with you. I mean, under Title 10, I can't lead troops, but I can manage and direct the hell out of them. And that's what I did. I saw myself in the chain of command. The commander said I was in the chain of command. Now, the thing is, being a deputy commander in any military structure means you really don't have anything, because the person who's signing the fitness reports is usually the commander. The deputies don't have that. So I had to earn their respect. I had to show that I was a value proposition for them. I just wasn't a tourist, and I wasn't pontificating about, the Westphalian political system. I had to show that I could roll up my sleeves with them and get stuff done. So I would sit in the J3, the operations center. I would work with them. I would work with the J2 analysts, the intelligence analysts. I would sit there and talk to them, and have back and forth. That's what I had to do. But success is what you need. It's the best thing you can have. And so what I found is I focused on those areas where I brought direct value. And the commander would then say, Phil, I want you to work on this issue. Can you do that? I said, sure. I would bring up an issue, say, this needs to be addressed by so-and-so. I would bring in the directors together. We would talk about it. And at times there was resistance to it. Beaucoup at first. Trust me. I mean, some of the stuff was oof. So what I did is I used the Socratic method, which is the worst thing you can do. And what I did is I just sat there. We'd have briefings, and I'd take the chair, and I started asking questions. Because what you also find in the military, and you know this better than I, is that when you're asked to give a presentation, they'll give you 3 courses of action. This is the classic PowerPoint thing, give 3 courses of action, options, so the commander can make the decision. and they get the brief. These are the 3 courses of action. Well, let's strip that out a little bit. Only one course of action is the one they want to advance. The other 2 are straw men. One is absurd, and the other one can't be done. And so there's really, what they do is they kind of direct you to one course of action. It's not an objective presentation. And so you start peeling that away. And then you start realizing their assumptions are there. So what I would use the theory of change approach, which is horrible when you're looking at the military decision-making process, or for my aid colleagues, the logical framework, when you start working from the end back versus from the beginning forward. That's hard, and that's what I would do. But I was able to deliver for them. When there were things that had to happen, agreements that had to be achieved, when they needed someone to get something through the State Department or through DOD, I would do that. My job was to help them manage the interagency in Washington and the international community abroad to achieve the security objectives the commander put forward. I helped draft, I was the principal drafter of the strategy, which became the theater campaign plan. That's how I injected myself. And I learned the lexicon. I could talk the talk, and so just simply doing that helped them. But you have to prove your mettle. You have to prove your worth. You know how it is. And also the physicality of it all. You know, the military, certainly the Army, it's a physical, Marines are physical. They use their physicality to dominate a meeting. You've got to learn how to take that down. Does it make sense? Yes. Okay.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ensign Cho, and I'm an intern from Public International Law and Policy Group. So you emphasize how the military and development people should work together, and you gave us several examples of development issues that should be addressed alongside security concerns. But I think I'm confused about what it would mean to take into account security concerns into development work. Because it's something beyond, for example, considering whether a certain development project will succeed when there's a conflict going on. So how would considering security issues in development work change the approach?
Okay, that's a good question. A couple of things. One is it's to take the parlance of the military, understand the operating environment that you're in. Many times people will focus on a challenge. Say, we wanted to work on delivery systems to bring healthcare to women in this province. Well, you know, you need a lot of, to be successful, you have to not just take in account the Ministry of Health. There's the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Finance, Ministries of Education, and probably the Ministries of Interior in terms of securing that facility, in terms of understanding that. When you're looking at the development needs of a community, trying to understand what those requirements are, what they want, is sometimes the biggest challenge. How does one go about doing that? I'll give you an example. Countering violent extremism, CVE, is the thing everyone wants to talk about. What does it take to make a local community allergic to extremism? And that means you have to talk to that local community. And from that, you'll have a development requirement. Education, health services. Many times these are communities that are, you know, in many places in Africa and developing world, the center doesn't hold the periphery, so the connection between that village, that community to the capital, the linkages to, are weak. So you're reinforcing those service provisions. And I'm not talking about a post-conflict environment or a pre-post-conflict environment or a pre-conflict environment. I'm talking about just general security in a local community. If it isn't there, if people don't trust the police, if they feel that the police or the military services are probably the greatest extractors of rents, then there's no kind of system you're going to put in place that's going to be sustainable over time, because eventually it will be corroded. And that needs to be taken into account. So understanding that local environment of where you are looking to have that project or that engagement is critical. And if a lot of development people will not do security, they won't think about it. They just, no. And that's, why would you do that? Why would you, it's like saying, you know, we're only going to help women. Well, what about the men? You know, you can't ignore, you know, there are some people that say, well, we're going to do this independent of that and the security. And if you don't have that security environment established, then what kind of environment are you working in? And I think that's an important thing to understand. It depends on the project. You know, you're going to go out there and build a well, and You want to make sure that well is going to be maintained and accepted, and you're going to have storage, and you're going to have warehousing and stuff like that. How are you going to keep that from getting stolen? How is that going to be secured? How are people going to respect the timetable that's going to be used to use that well? You know, that authority that's there. That's important.
Hi.
Yes.
Just, the microphone's coming, just a second.
Okay. Pretty loud.
So am I. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bethany Mangigian. I'm here with a group from Tulane University.
Excellent.
We are part of a Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy. I'm also
New Orleans can speak about that.
Yes, they can. I'm also doing a joint degree in social work, and my question was about the learning curve that you talked about with the military presence in other countries, and what efforts or initiatives might be replicable in building that cultural competency, and who should be the main driver of that?
You know, the way our military works, people have to be technically proficient in either the combat arms or whatever services, logistical services they're providing, and they have to keep that edge to be successful, and we want them to keep that edge, right? So their ability to understand a cultural environment that's different from the one that they're operating in is something that's difficult to do. One, it comes through the briefings that they get, through the intel services, through people like DIA and others who provide them the background material that they need. But it comes from the get-go. The minute they land on the ground, who are they engaging with? And this is where an American ambassador, a U.S. embassy, must be in charge. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen ambassadors kind of leave it to the defense attaché to manage. Wrong. No. And the other thing is that the assessment process needs to be sincere. And you don't really see that much. I mean, the military, DOD is pretty good about doing assessments, but actually doing real hard driving assessments is tough to get. And this particularly applies to the special forces, who do most of the stuff in Africa. They're operators, they're special forces people, because they are most attuned to it, and they tend to keep going back. And probably the best programs that we have are the National Guard programs, where we have, let's say, I think North Dakota. Yeah, the North Dakota National Guard has been working with Ghana for I don't know how long on maritime security. You know, the shoreline in North Dakota isn't that big. But they've done a great job. Why? Because they're the same folks who keep going back. They have these relationships going back. And in my view, that state partnership program is a great way to do that. And the other thing is that AFRICOM is relatively new. It's only been around since 2007. Before you had UCOM, PACOM, CENTCOM managing Africa stuff. Only since 2007. And so there is it's coming along. You know, people who work in Latin America keep working with Southcom, and they keep going back to it. That's going to change over time. And so I think just exposure is going to help a lot for that cross-cultural issue, and the appreciation. The other thing is that if military careers advance and are made successful by the kind of engagements we're talking about, then you're going to have to go to Africa, because it's going to get harder. And that has yet to be developed, but it's coming along.
In the back?
Well, then all
No,
three.
start on the far end, yeah.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lubiner. This summer I'm interning at the DoD, but when I'm not there, I'm a rising senior at Tufts University. At Tufts, I'm the leader of an organization that's focused on civil-military relations, and we have branches at West Point and the Naval Academy. And something that I've experienced with my peers is convincing many liberal arts international relations students that civil-military relations is an important facet of our degrees. So I was wondering if you had any advice about the most convincing ways to talk to people about the necessity of improving civil-military relations, and also the hard skills that undergraduates should focus on so that we're prepared when we're in an environment with both civilian and military personnel.
Wow, that's a good question. It depends on the circumstances that you're looking at, right? So, but one is, just as there is a kind of a suspicion within the military, I find also within the liberal arts world, there's a suspicion of the military, which isn't healthy. And what we're finding is that, and with your colleagues, just ask them, where has development worked in an insecure environment? Where has it worked? We have spent billions in Africa, in the Congo, for nothing. Sorry about that, man.
Sorry.
He was ambassador there. All right? what do we do about that? How does one engage that? If you're really into development, you want your development to be durable and sustainable, which means what? Which means the country must be secure. The people must have confidence in their police forces, in their militaries. That's the other challenge we have, okay? At AFRICOM, we train militaries. We're good at training other militaries, technical stuff, you know, how to go on patrol, how to fix a boat engine, how to do that. Now, tell me about what do we do for police forces in Africa. The most important security services in Africa are the police, and we do basically nothing with them because we're not authorized to do anything with them. Okay? So, how does one deal with this question? And the big question, intellectually, for our liberal arts friends, and I'm a product of liberal arts college, is this thing about state security versus human security. State security is civilian security. That nexus, the thing that bridges it, is governance. Good governance, be it in the security sector, be it anywhere. And one does not move forward with governance without having an understanding of both sides of that equation, right? And I think, how does one deal with that? How does one understand governance? Well, I think some fundamental things have to be understood. One, if you don't understand the region you're working in, so the hard skills are area studies, foreign language. You know, you got to go in there. You can't go in there and say, well, you know, donde están your propellers and what's your como se llama. You can't work like that. Okay, you got to speak the language. That's a major challenge for us, particularly in our military. You know, there's that. There's also the quantitative side of it. You know, if you go in with an understanding of how to do project management with the assessment side of it, you'll already 10 feet taller than anybody else because you'll already figure out, okay, how are we going to evaluate that we're successful? And what are the metrics? What are the kinds of analyses that need to be done there? The statistical properties that you need to understand that you're within that bell curve. A lot of people go in with very soft understanding of stuff like that. And that needs to change. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry to make you run around. Will?
Now I'm going to be in trouble because Will Embry's going to ask me a question. I don't know what I'm going to answer that.
Thanks. I'm Will Embry. I was in the military. I did a career in the State Department, and for the last almost decade, I've been working as a U.S. Contractor supporting DoD in the state. So I've looked at this from several different aspects. And first, I think what you said is absolutely spot on.
Thank you.
You touched all the things that I really care about. It's the institutional issues that are the most complex. Over the last, since Vietnam, the DoD and state and aid have done a pretty good job about trying to develop institutions that make this better. Country team, which is run by the ambassador in an embassy and includes all the agencies that are in the country, including DoD and aid and development agencies. It's one place that, in general, really works.
As a matter of fact, I think it's the only interagency process that does work.
Yeah. We tried hard in Iraq and Afghanistan with the PRTs, the provincial reconstruction teams, which were in Iraq, I think they were headed by the state person. In Afghanistan, they were headed by the DoD person, but they were state. They were diplomacy, development, and defense all rolled into one. It was a work in progress. I think they had some things that worked well and some things didn't. But if you get further away from the field, it's harder to get the institutions to get together. Uh-huh. One of the problems which I had in the past was between the combatant commanders, who have a whole region, they have planes and money and power, and ambassadors, especially in Africa, who are small and poor and don't have planes and can barely get to the next town out. AFRICOM, when it got invented, was trying to get around this. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how well the combatant commanders, combatant commander in AFRICOM is getting along with the ambassadors. Is it working better than it does in other regions?
I think, first of all, the fourth combatant commander has just been sworn in, so we don't have a long track record there. But I can say from my personal experience working with 3 of them, both as an ambassador and working in Washington and then as a deputy, that they got the message that the boss on the ground is the ambassador, and that whatever she says or he says, we matter to it. Now, it's incumbent upon the ambassador to be the boss. Story. It's not a story. We'll talk about that offline. But the thing is that it's much improved. Because before, when UCOM was around, there was a real tension between the deputy commander who was in charge of Africa at the time and what was going on. Some were great, some were, okay? What I'm seeing now with AFRICOM is they recognize that they cannot meet their mission objectives, their theater campaign plans, without direct and understanding of the objectives of the ambassador and what that individual wants to achieve on the thing. There also is a growing recognition that our embassies are understaffed and under-resourced. And so one of the things they're doing is they're providing assistance. The challenge we have is that, AFRICOM will say, we'll send you, Madam Ambassador, we'll send you a small team. We'll send you a team of 20 people. Well, that's larger than the embassy. How do you manage that? And so just to have the resources to manage the help that AFRICOM is sending can be a challenge. There's a much greater appreciation of that now. The ambassador, one of the biggest the jobs for me, for the other deputy commander who was for military operations, and for the commander and others, we were always flying. I mean, I was on the road flying commercial air, not military air. I wish I was, but commercial air, to Africa 2 weeks out of the month. The third week, I was going to Washington or Europe, talking to our allies, getting a sense. And it was constantly talking to them and constantly trying to figure out what do our ambassadors want, what do they need, how can we help them, and giving them an appreciation of what assets we can bring to bear. But there's also a fact that people think that AFRICOM has a lot more stuff than it actually does. In terms of airlift, we have 5 planes. 5. But when you're using one to evacuate a place, provide relief, one has to stay in reserve for emergency repairs, one sits in Djibouti, you don't have that many planes. This is just C-130s. Not that many, The other thing, it's a problem that we're facing now is that the other institution you didn't mention was Congress. They have a role. And they need to be engaged more by everybody. And they need to be engaged together. That dichotomy of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, when you're talking about Africa, that's a false dichotomy. You got to bring the two together. And the other thing is the authorities. You know this better than I. I mean, the authorities just aren't there to be effective in certain ways. And there should be a way that state money can go to DOD and DOD money can go. For example, there was an effort we tried to do in a country where we needed to provide aid, some resources, $10 million plus to work in this community where we were engaging militarily, because that would help sustain our engagement, our security operations, but at the same time help develop the community. We wanted to transfer that money from a DOD account to a 150 account for aid. We were told you cannot do that, shall not happen, will not go on forward. And aid couldn't engage. And as a result, we had to continue to move forward, but we did not have the environment that we wanted. And I'm not convinced it's going to be that sustainable without that development aid going in there. And we recognize that, the military recognized that, but we couldn't get those authorities. That has to change. But that's a dialogue that has to happen talking to our congressional friends. And the other thing is this is development experts, all of you, that one-year money is nonsense money. You need to have money that is multi-year to engage over time. And you just need to get that. So figure it out. You're the new generation. You got to figure it out.
In the back.
Hi, my name is Maya Agan. I work for Senator Michael Bennett's office. I'm also an ethnic studies major, so first I'm asking for your card now.
Okay.
Second of all, my question is, do you feel, especially with Congress in particularly, that they see Africa actually as 54 countries, or do you think that they still see Africa as Africa, the country itself?
I think aside from a select group of people in the Congress, they don't think about Africa. And if they do, it's, one or two places, usually a problem. They don't have a full appreciation of it, and they should. The demographics, the challenges of Africa are huge, to quote Donald Trump. Huge. In 15 years, the population of Africa will be 2 billion people. The average age, median age, is going to be 19, 20 years old. Fastest urbanization rates on the planet. You're going to have mega cities of more than 10 million people. Right now you have 2. You're going to have beaucoup more in about 15 years, right? And they're all youthful. You have unemployment, underemployment. They're also one of the highest levels of connectivity going on the planet, and they're all using mobile smartphones, okay? So they're talking to each other, they're Twittering each other, they're SMSing each other, all of that. They're young, they're coming into cities. The cities have no services, there's no municipal planning. Johannesburg, I was at a conference recently. Johannesburg is getting 225,000 people a year coming into the city from outside of South Africa. We're not talking about the internal movements of South Africans to Johannesburg. We're talking about the Malawians, the Zimbabweans, Zambians coming in. 225,000. Everyone's talking about the migration flow across the Med. Think about what's going on within the continent as well. What we're seeing in the crisis in the Mediterranean is just the tip of the iceberg. If we don't help these countries deal, and we're going to have different approaches. It may not be working with the central government. It may be working with the mayor or working with the governor. And in my view, the second half of the century is going to be the question of dealing with governors and mayors, who may actually be more important. Who's more powerful, the mayor of Mogadishu or the president of Somalia? Think about it. Okay? I mean, these are the issues that we have to contend with. And so I think looking at those problems and that problem set is something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate. And that's the problem, really, isn't it? We deal with the immediate. We don't think about what's over the horizon, what's the long-term issues here, until they're too big. And the largest labor pool on the planet will be Africa in 15 years. So you have all the elements for an incredible economic prosperity. Youthful population, urbanization, connectivity, connections, energy, resources, and those are all the same drivers for conflict. Which way is that table going to tip? What role do we have in it? And what role can Congress play in that?
I'll go over there for one, and then we'll get time for one more after that, because we're hitting our time limit here.
Ambassador, Ian Murphy recently transitioned out of the Army, and I can speak
Congratulations.
I can speak to some of the
My son is transitioning out of the Army too. He's a captain. He's going to be getting
great.
out of it. So.
But I'm sure he can as well speak to some of the intransigence that you mentioned.
Oh yeah.
I was wondering, you mentioned how there's a fair amount of focus on health. There's sort of problems with timeline and sort of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to where does the private sector, sort of like profit-driven side of things, come into this? What kind of frictions you've seen with that, and maybe what opportunities going forward?
Well, I think, okay, I'm really glad you talked about the private sector. Nothing's going to work without the private sector. Nothing. I mean, development aid at best is catalytic in creating an environment that will foster investment. But economic development is a private sector thing, okay? That's what makes it sustainable. And creating that enabling environment in those countries so that domestic investors, not foreigners, can feel confident to put their money in. But right now, if all the illicit flows out of Africa exceed all the donor assistance going into Africa, we got a problem, which is, by the way, that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. So the private sector has a tremendous role. Why? What did they do? What did this private sector do? Oh, they create jobs. And they bring innovation. And they bring wealth and prosperity that's durable over time. They create wealth. Military assistance doesn't create wealth. Okay? Development assistance should, but most of that money is being spent in Washington. The wealth is being created in Washington, not in Africa. So really, that's an important role. The private sector, I think, and the U.S. government is trying to be better at it in terms of folding in the private sector into some of the efforts that are going forward. We have a long way to go, particularly on the military side, aside from just contracting, but how do we engage with them? We're looking at that question, but it's a question of ethics. It's a question of money. It's a question of different priorities. And also, most American companies don't know where Africa is. You know, they don't know. So you're dealing with European companies, Chinese companies. They're the number one investor in Africa, right? How do you deal with them? How do you engage with them in a sustainable way? And that comes to the question of governance, which touches on that C word, corruption.
Oops.
Oops, yeah.
And used to, and then that's it, and then we'll have to close off the
Okay.
questions.
I'll make them short answers, too.
Hey, I'm Jonathan Emerson. I'm an intelligence officer with the Army, and I study counterinsurgency, particularly in Afghanistan. And a lot of the stuff you said is just absolutely true of what I've come across in terms of end state and timelines, and how they're both just perfectly interconnected, and how not a lot of people want to put realistic timelines on it. So the counterinsurgency manual says you want to make sure you give enough time, but then there's a ... and there's no time there.
I know.
And then we brought up Congress and stuff like that, and you talk about how they want to do these whistle-stop tours, they want to see the wells, they want to see what's going on. Oh, cool, you started a school, mission success, let's get out of there. So my question would be, in your experience, how do you set realistic timelines that, one, don't scare people away, and two, make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page?
Well, I think that's a hard appreciation to make. One is that I haven't been successful on that front. Why? Because the funding mechanisms drive the timelines in many respects. It's bizarre. And you're absolutely right about the special forces guys. They go off, they do a project, to do an exercise, it's a success. Soft forces are always successful. But if you're doing a series of them in a country over a course of years, is the country better off? That assessment has to happen. They don't do that. Soft forces don't do those kind of assessments. So I think that needs to be looked at. This comes back to the congressional question. If the funding is realistic in the way it's apportioned and allotted to deal with the challenges, the development challenges, the security challenges, through a rich and strong dialogue with members of Congress, then the money thing won't be so much a driver of the timeline. And that's hard to do. And the other thing is that I think sometimes hard stories, hard news is important. If you don't have an appreciation of how hard it is, how long it's going to take, then why would you do it in the first place? And frankly, sometimes going in half-cocked without a sense of how long it's going to take can actually make things much, much worse. Spending too much time on counterterrorism and not doing development means you could very well have a strong military that is maybe doing something else. I don't know, Got to watch out for that. So that timeline issue is tied to funding in many respects. There's a growing appreciation that to make things sustainable, you need more than 1 year money. And that the projects has to be a series of things, and you assess and you evaluate as you move along. You don't wait till, we're done, okay, let's assess it. Oh, the assessment didn't get done. Or previous assessments that influence current project design. That's a good thing, but it's not utilized very much.
Final question.
Thanks, Irv Chapman. I've been with Bloomberg. A more general question.
Yes,
The
sir.
popular view of the U.S. role in Africa during the Cold War was to throw money at the place to keep it out of Russian hands.
Yeah.
Since then, the Chinese have been up and down building railroads and stadiums and God knows what else. In view of all of the above, during your career at these various stages,
Yes, I've been through all of it, yeah.
what gives you the most satisfaction about what the United States has actually accomplished for Africa and the Africans?
That's a good question. I've talked to people about what my career meant. I didn't do the London, Paris, Rome thing. Didn't serve in Beijing or Moscow. Didn't serve in Abuja or Johannesburg or Pretoria. I worked in little countries, Malawi, Madagascar, Gabon, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire. There is a deep font of goodwill to the United States in Africa. Africans really, really, really like Americans. And it's because of what the kind of things we talk about and the way we engage. We don't carry the colonial baggage that some of our European partners have. But it's more than that. It's the way we are. We're optimistic people, generally. We talk about the future. Most Africans, and this is the one challenge that's there, though, is that Africans are very historical. Their oral history, they can talk about what happened 2 generations ago as if it was yesterday. Americans don't know what they had for breakfast. Okay? But we think about tomorrow. And for us, tomorrow is very important. Prosperity is very important. And they see that, and that sense of optimism. Africans really do appreciate the values that we put forward in terms of governance, democracy, human rights, private sector involvement, dealing with corruption. They appreciate that. They appreciate the fact that when they get training from our U.S. military, they're getting the same training we give our troops, not what we gave troops last generation. Okay? They're struck by how Americans are engaging, that we talk to people, we engage at all levels. And when I look at my career, I can honestly say, and I'm not bragging, I can honestly say that I improved the lives of about 80 million people directly by my actions as a junior officer, as a foreign service officer, as an ambassador, working in Africa, by helping people deal with education challenges, by helping people with elections, by helping people address the Ebola crisis, saving lives. We're seen as that way. We're seen as generous people. And they may not agree with a lot of our policies. And you'd be surprised, like, one of the most popular presidents in Africa is George Bush. For all the challenge he may have had internationally, he did a tremendous amount of good for Africa in terms of MCC, in terms of the PEPFAR program. They see us as helping them deal with the scourge of AIDS, dealing with the development challenges of children, trafficking in persons, that kind of thing. So I think there is a lot of goodwill. We need to continue to, one, we have to recognize that goodwill is not infinite, that we have to earn it. We have to justify that goodwill. We need to listen to them more, to Africans. I think in the Cold War, we kind of worked with the systems that were there and the regimes that were there because we were fighting the big fight, fighting communism, and I was part of that. Our job was to stop communism. It was a scourge. And for those of you who didn't live with it, trust me, it sucked. But we haven't been adept at that post-Cold War environment as we should be. We're getting there. And now we have this new challenge, this social phenomenon of extremism that scares everyone. Muslims, Christians, animists, everybody. And the Africans are on the front line. Let's not forget that. We are helping Africans. We're training them in security forces, and they are dying, some of them, fighting extremists, be it in Somalia, be it in the Sahel or the Sahara. And they're on the front lines. So let's not forget that. Let's admire them for that. They admire us. I think more admiration for the Africans, I think, is what's needed. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.